Don't get me wrong, I love New York City. And one of the things that helps you get away from all this is hanging out in Central Park. We have some amazing parks in New York City, but Central Park is by far my favorite. I give tours of it, so I happen to know it really well. If you want to check those out, you can see the link in the description below. It's called Central Park Sunset Tours, but these are places that aren't even necessarily on my tour. I think you're really gonna love them. Just some nice, quiet, hidden gems. So let's get right down to it. Right near 103rd Street Station on the B and C train, there is a great place called The Pool. And it's a little bit quieter than most of Central Park because it's in the northern part of the park. And I happened to live right by it when I first moved to the city. Didn't really realize how lucky I was back then. It's one of the smaller bodies of water in the park, but it's super relaxing. Lots of willow trees running over it, ducks and geese that live in it. The designers, Olmsted and Vaux, decided to take Montaigne's rivulet, which was a stream that ran up through the park to the northeast, and they took it and pooled it up, and that's where you get the name The Pool. Before they pooled it, they actually created a few little waterfalls that run through the park. You can follow the old body of water as it makes its way through the park. It's a great place to just go, relax, and not be around other people like you might be at the southern parts of the park. The next part of the park I want to tell you about is called the PINETUM. It's at the northern part of the Great Lawn at about 83rd Street. It's a place I've gone with friends several times, usually when we've got food and want to go eat in the park, because there are picnic tables there. It's one of the few places in the park where you can find a picnic table. It also sort of has this really cool retro, like camping ground feel to it, and you're surrounded by pine trees, thus the name PINETUM. This came along in the 1970s. The city itself was suffering from a financial problem, and a man named Arthur Ross decided to donate some money to plant some pine trees in the park. Now, it's interesting because he just happened to plant it at a place where Olmsted and Vaux, the original park designers, had at one point in time wanted to plant a bunch of pine trees. They called this area that was up and down the carriage drive, which is now used for bicycles and runners, the Winter Drive. And they planted a bunch of pine trees, but they didn't last in the city because they weren't very resistant to our conditions, and there was a lot of air pollution, and so most of them died. Well, Arthur Ross comes along in 1971 and plants these pine trees because he was really upset about the fact that there was a really ugly building there that held maintenance equipment, and you could see the police station, and so he planted a bunch of pine trees in front of them. He was somebody who worked in paper products and was, interestingly enough, really into the trees, particularly coniferous ones. And so he took the small amount of trees that they put in initially and expanded that to about 600 by the 80s. It's a great place to go and relax, eat with a friend, but also take in all these different varieties of pine trees. At the southern part of the park, near 59th Street and 6th Avenue, there is a small 4-acre woodland called the HALLET Nature Sanctuary. Olmsted and Vaux, the designers, originally named it the Promontory because it juts out over the pond. It was closed in 1934 and turned into a bird sanctuary by our parks commissioner at that time, Robert Moses. Robert Moses was definitely a cantankerous character. I've talked about him on this channel already, and I'm sure there will be more. It's possible that Robert Moses just really didn't like the woodlands in Central Park because they were difficult to police. So he put a fence around this woodland and decided to call it a bird sanctuary, and said, well, let's just see what happens if we let nature take its course. The problem, of course, with doing that is that none of Central Park is natural. It's all landscaped and planned. And so from the time it closed in 1934 all the way up till the first time people went into it for a really long time in 2001, weeds took over the area. And so the Central Park Conservancy had a big job ahead of them, and they had to spend a lot of time removing weeds that were really ingrained in the area. They finally opened it to the public again in 2016, and since that time it has gotten longer hours. You can now go in and wander around on the beautiful pathways in there and just take it in. It's so relaxing, and there are several different places that you can look out and see the city. It's really interesting how close you are to the city. There are also great views of the pond, and there's a waterfall. This is kind of my favorite thing. If you are outside looking in to the HALLET Nature Sanctuary, you'll see it, and it's really beautiful. And if you wander around, you can actually go up and sit at the top of the waterfall, as people sometimes do. But if you look closely, you'll see there are pipes with what is city tap water that are actually feeding that waterfall. Up by 109th Street, you will find the oldest building in Central Park. It actually predates the park. It's called the Blockhouse. You'll have to wander into the North Woods to find it, but it is well worth the search. It's an old fort from the War of 1812, built on the site of what was previously a fort for the Revolutionary War. The War of 1812, kind of glossed over sometimes in history. It's a pretty embarrassing war that we got into. We were providing weapons to both France and England. And as we started shipping over those weapons, they started being captured by the British if they were not going to England. So, we decided to declare war. We ventured into Canada and tried to take some territory, but the Canadians wound up burning down the White House. Not one of our great military victories. We were pretty worried in New York that the British were gonna come and attack us, and so we were already down at the New York Harbor in the southern part of the city. They wound up attacking Stonington, Connecticut. So we very quickly went back and fortified what had been forts for the American Revolution. And the Blockhouse is the only one of those forts that is still remaining in the park. Olmsted and Box decided to leave it as sort of a rustic ruin. It's a really cool, quiet place, a lot of great bird watching, very off the beaten path, and a fun thing to find if you've got some time. Lastly, I want to tell you about one of my absolute favorite places in the park called the Shakespeare Garden. It's right near the Delacorte Theater where they have Shakespeare in the park, and it's sort of tucked behind the Swedish Marionette Cottage. The Shakespeare Garden is 4 acres of beautiful plants and flowers that were in Shakespeare's poems and plays. It's really exceptionally beautiful, and the plantings change every season. I think the Shakespeare Garden is a great place to go on a date. It's quiet. There are lots of beautiful flowers. You can walk around, talk about things, sit down at a bench for a while. It's got a really interesting history too. Before it was the Shakespeare Garden, it was a rock garden started by Parks Commissioner Charles Stover, who is a really interesting guy that we'll definitely talk about in another video. Stover was a very controversial Parks Commissioner. He had a lot of problems with staff, got into fights, was told off for misusing parklands and building things and knocking things down. A lot of similarities to another guy who we've talked quite a bit about, Robert Moses. We'll come back to Moses in just a second. But Charles Stover started this garden as a place for kids to go and learn. And then he passed the baton on to an entomologist, Dr. Edmund Southwick. And Southwick decided to turn it into something he called the Garden of the Heart, which had a lot of plants from Shakespeare's poems and plays in it. He would actually be on site, and kids would come in and he'd walk them through and tell them about the herbs, and they loved it. But for some reason, the city in 1916 decided they were going to discontinue the budget for it. And so there was a big letter writing campaign where people wrote to newspapers, and finally somebody ponied up and donated the money to save the Shakespeare Garden. It was later expanded from 2 acres to 4 acres by Robert Moses, who was a Parks Commissioner, as I said, in 1934, and really loved Shakespeare. He expanded the garden and put in plaques that had Shakespeare verse on them that corresponded with the plants. He also added a bench, and he dedicated it to Charles Stover, who started the garden. The irony was that he talked about in his speech what a great public servant Stover was, and sort of glossed over all of his controversial career. That bench now today is called the whispering bench, and if you whisper into one side of it, you can hear it in the other. People love to play around with that bench. That is my video for 5 quiet hideaways in Central Park. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please leave a comment below, tell me what you thought. Like the video if you want to see more great content like this, and if you actually, do want to watch that content, you can subscribe and check out all our upcoming videos. I'm reviewing every restaurant in Little Italy at the moment. I've also got an interview coming up with one of my friends that's on Broadway. Got so much great content coming for you right here on City Boy.